right. Hi, everybody. I'll lighten it up a little bit. How many designers are out in the audience? Yeah, all right, cool. Well, I'm a designer too. I'm also a trained architect, and I have a firm called Evolve Environment Architecture, and we do a lot of thinking. We're kind of a sustainability think tank, and we do a lot of thinking about sustainable design. I know you've all heard that term before. Sorry, I'm trying to look out because I'm looking to see who's still peeking their hand up to say they're a designer. We do a lot of thinking about sustainable design, and I want to just unpack that term just for a minute because let's think about what sustainable means. You know, sustainable it describes a relationship, right? It's a negotiation to create mutually beneficial relationship between two parties, right? I know all of you that are married know very well about what sustainable means, all the negotiation, right? Sustain that relationship. And design is an action. Design isn't a thing, it's an action, right? And so sustainable design is really a process. It's an ongoing process to kind of create a mutually beneficial relationship between two things. You know, design is an action, and I would say that you don't have to have the word designer or registered architect after your name to be a designer. Design is a mediation that we use to relate to our environment, right? We change things around. So now let me ask again, how many of you are all designers? You better see a lot more hands going up, right? So really, we're all designers in our own ways, even though you might not think of yourself that way. And I want to talk to you today about some work that we're doing regarding a living city, what a living city is. I want to describe it as a process, an ongoing negotiation that's informed by a lot of things and that we all need to take a role in so that we can change places like this into places like this. And so if you follow sustainable design or kind of urban planning and sustainability, you know that there's a lot of focus on technological innovation. Think about sustainability. You think about things like solar panels and the kind of visible things we see in our environment. But I would argue that technological innovation needs to remain a focus, but really community formation, or the way we work together, needs to come into place in order for that technological innovation to have meaning. And that's where we come into sustainability as a cultural issue. So I'm going to talk about some projects that we're doing. You know, we are in Western Pennsylvania. We're experiencing a transformation right now, but there's a lot of places that are kind of in the decline, shrinking cities. And this is a map showing places that are experiencing shrinking. But every city in the country, every city in the world has places that shrink as well as places that grow. And we were really interested in those types of environments, especially when they began to reach their tipping point and turn. And so we might all be familiar here with where we are in downtown Pittsburgh, but we've been working with a number of communities in our region, not far from downtown, in these type of planning efforts. So today I'm going to present to you on two particular communities, work for two particular communities, one called Larimer, or Larmer if you're native, and Homewood, and demonstrate a little bit of what I mean by this being an ongoing process. So in 1940, the neighborhood of Larmer looked pretty much like many other places in our region. It was successful in terms of having a lot of population. There were 13,500 people. They had a kind of business district. The purple on the chart there is the business district, and all the orange on that chart are residential properties. This is kind of a use diagram. It's not a literal map of the neighborhood. And their kind of business district looks something like this. And then familiar to us, perhaps, is what happens in the upcoming years. Fast forward to 1975, and you have half the population. Fast forward to 1995, and you've halved it again. We're at 3,000 people. And in 2011, when we began working with the community partners there, we were at actually less than 2,000 people. That creates an extreme stress on that environment and really kind of causes you to reconsider how we reconnect points that have been taken apart. Because that's really what this denuding of our urban environment does, is it disconnects systems and it doesn't allow us to see patterns that once existed or to see patterns that could exist. So what's happening in this community, and not in every community, but in many, is that there's a kind of pivot point. There's a change in the conditions that are causing some growth pressures. And when you think about how you might want to move forward, what we did with the community is to help understand what might happen in 2035. Could this become, and what would we imagine it be if it were a living city? So first you might want to kind of stabilize, right, and consolidate resources. You might want to take the areas that have the most vacant land and start to aggregate those so that you can make larger moves. The next thing that you might want to do is to think about growing and creating economic security, allowing people who have equity in the neighborhood to maintain that equity, connecting people to economic resources such as jobs and transit to allow for some growth to begin to happen. Next, you might want to diversify because you don't want to you don't want to rely too much on any one particular thing. So whether that be different types of housing that you're putting in or different types of people that you're encouraging to move there, those are all important things. And lastly, you need to understand what it takes to sustain or to maintain that vibrancy, which isn't always easy and isn't something that we know well in advance, but we need to make a commitment to doing that. It has commercial and it has residential. And the new diagram that we envision is a lot more colorful. What does that mean? The difference between a living city and the cities of the past is that we think about things a little differently, specifically in relationship to what makes up a community and how that community works. The colors that you see relate to what we call site programs, thinking about producing your own food, thinking about the role of green space not just as a beautiful place to be, but as a working landscape. Likewise, how we produce energy, how we deal with our water source, and how we deal with wastewater and waste are all things that need to be closed-looped on site. And so while that is represented now within the community itself, we need to think about not just the technologies that enable that, but the community relationships that allow that to be maintained. So living cities designed not just for environmental systems, but they are also designed for the social infrastructure that supports them. So let me tell you what I mean by that. First, if you understand a little bit about design, I think we need to think differently about the way we think about design. Right now, when you deal with urban design projects, we think a lot about things like use, about where certain functions go, about how transit connects, about walkability, livability. Those things are all really great things, and we absolutely need to continue forward with those. But I'm going to introduce the term eco-districts, because eco-districts consider three things in particular: energy, water, and food, in a way that's very different than maybe we've thought about urban design in the past. This has to do a lot with the availability of data. It has to do with the fact that we can understand and receive information back much faster. It has to do with ideas of social norming, that when we communicate well with each other, we start to shape the possibilities of what we can do together. As a matter of fact, one of our community partners is revealing a Google app to support these types of processes tomorrow. And it means that we think about these systems in a quantified way, which is kind of a funny thing to do. How do you quantify these things? Because you see, if you start putting things out there for kind of an urban design plan, and we want to make things more sustainable, I might ask that you change a light bulb, or I might ask that you kind of create a water garden or plant a garden, and those are good things to do, right? But if you want to get to the things that are at scale and far more effective, it's not a random smattering of things. There's actually a logical kind of organization of these things. Required action takes time, and it takes an ability to get to scale. And the things that are most efficient in that upper right-hand corner take something that we refer to as community capacity. And community capacity can be designed. It's not simply a random engagement of a community to say, come tell us what you think. It's an enrichment of that community to be able to understand what they want for the future. High-capacity communities have very strong decision-making mechanisms. They are good at learning. They have legal resources, which leads to financial resources. So this is easy. These four things, when you think about capacity, are easy when you have a single owner who's thinking about developing a large site. They have an organization that people are paid to kind of think towards a singular goal. You learn well, you have financial resources, you have legal resources. But a quilted community, which is what we call a community that has a lot of infrastructure already in place, has people who don't necessarily agree with each other, who don't necessarily even care about the issues yet, and certainly lassoing those financial and legal resources are the challenge. So we say that in the design process of creating a living city, it's not the end result, it's the process that lifts the community and enables them to achieve these greater kind of technologies or efficiencies, and in the end, the race is really the prize. So that lets us ask a couple questions, and I'll show you some of the results that could happen when you start to think this way. For instance, we could ask a question with this community. We asked the question, how could energy independence make a community more resilient? And so we looked at an idea is, could you take this community to net zero energy? Could you produce everything that they need on site with a renewable energy? For instance, solar panels we looked at. This is really important because in that community and in many communities, low-income folks spend a lot of their income on energy. So you could really boost the ability of that community to be resilient with this. So what we found is in projecting forward with different technologies and increased use and increased population, we needed about 40 acres of area to do the residential district in this neighborhood and about 63 acres to do the commercial district. And so if you map that out onto the actual neighborhood, there's really not enough roof area, even if every roof was perfect, to do solar panels. So, you have to kind of test the boundaries right away to know maybe we're not relying on a single energy technology, nor would we want to. But now we have to think about how that neighborhood ticks and how different policies and different technologies and, frankly, different ways of engaging the people that live in those areas or work in those areas can support a robust and sustainable use of energy. So for instance, if that's the district level, you think about it at a block level, how does this work? You get things like a school. You get somebody who's going to act as a large project, and you think about how in the renovation of a school, you might also be renovating football fields. You start to think about technologies that take that school offline and contribute to the larger goals of that neighborhood to be net zero energy. You think about new developments that are coming in and putting in ideas like, can you make this thing net zero energy? Can you have certain criteria so that people who move in, especially if it's low income, pay less of the money that they need to live there because it's very, very efficient, right? But I think the interesting piece is how you tap into the existing community. And in this case here, if you're doing a public improvement, like where the 4 dots are is kind of a scheduled new park, perhaps, for this. Is it possible to put in technologies that feed back into the neighborhood and connect them to the new development and kind of reprogram how an existing community feels about being a part of a larger narrative so that you don't leave folks behind because you have some new shiny things going in? If you tried to get people in that neighborhood to put solar panels on, you would have a hard time going house to house. But if you begin to create a new narrative and a new identity for that neighborhood and connect people literally and programmatically, you have a much better chance of folks all kind of coming on board and of gaining real material as well as kind of cultural benefits. Likewise, how might we talk about food and waste? Can we close the loops of food and waste in the neighborhood? And right now we all are dying to garden, right? It's February and we can't wait to get outside. But this is a lot more than thinking about gardening. Can you transform the way people relate to each other because of an activity? Because of the way that activity is laid out across. So we calculated, could we provide 15% of the neighborhood's nutrients on site? Could we do that? If we did, we would need an 18-acre urban farm and 14 acres of community gardens for that to happen out of their 250-acre site, neighborhood site. So when you start to look at how that lays out, we look and see, well, gee, we talked about aggregating open space because there was a lot of vacancies. That's great. Can we get to scale and make an urban farm that actually works? Can it be economically sustainable? Can it have adjacent community gardens where there's high levels of education and assist that allow people to go from 0 to 60 in terms of what they can raise and how well they can do it because you have those resources shared? And then can you distribute that out through the neighborhood, maybe in a pathway of connected little lot gardens, but do it in a way that recognizes the material process flows as well as the possibility of creating a sub-identity within that community of people who love to garden, creating places for them to communicate and to engage each other. And then at the lot scale, can you do the same thing? Can you think about how the large scale projects can work, how the new development can work, and how that can tap back in to the community to allow them to take advantage of these new resources that are coming back in and have that be part of their identity as well. Lastly is water. How can water become an asset and not a liability? And we know in this region, this is a big issue for us, right? Like many places in the Northeast, we have combined sewer overflows. And to fix that problem of outflows into our river, we have about a $50 billion problem. If we have to fix this, how do we do it in a way that benefits the community as well as solving the problem of quality and quantity of our water? So what we did is we modeled. We said, okay, how much water is coming off of this site right now? How much is being used domestically? And then the anticipated population growth was about 3 times the current population. So if we got to 6,000 people, could we keep that same volume of water domestically so that they're not using any more water than what the 2,000 folks are using right now? But can we infiltrate or can we decrease the runoff in a way that would benefit the environment, take some pressure off of the utilities, and solve our combined sewer overflow? So we modeled a couple different ways of kind of design in the community and found that indeed we could. We could take it back almost to pre-development stages of how much water was actually coming off the site. And when you look at that across the geography of the community, you have places like what we call water streets, which are residential streets where you can put a rain barrel on your house, but what if your neighbor's not such a good landowner and they disconnect it and you don't want a flooded basement? You need redundant systems of public investment in the streetscape as well as your own private activities. Water streets are a way of kind of encouraging that type of development with policy and incentives to make that happen. Likewise, when you get to the business district, the cleanest water in that system is coming off of those business roofs. Why not reuse that within their building and their processes? Why not help them figure out how to advance that within their business, to share those resources across the businesses, and to recapture that benefit and take it out of the system? Lastly, you have the parkland. In this case, for those of you that are familiar with Larimer, it's Negley Run, Washington Boulevard. Why not look at that area and reestablish the natural systems that were already in place there? It was a run. That's why it was called Negley Run. And when you get to the kind of block scale too, you have opportunity where there is a kind of large industrial set of buildings here on the left. That was a wetland at one time. And next to the high school, when you're going to build a new field, why not try to capture some of the water and store it and slow it underneath the field itself? When you have new development, new housing, why not make that net zero at that point, reuse within the buildings or infiltrate on site? However, it's in that kind of, again, that zone where you interface with the existing community that the opportunities arise to create great new public spaces, to help people connect the dots as to how resources flow within their neighborhood, and to solve the problems that we're going to pay a lot of money to solve in other ways. So, I was presenting this material at a conference in Montreal, and 2 years ago, and I happened to check my email beforehand, and I got a news feed from the Post-Gazette that said that there was a flash flood on Washington Boulevard. And I'm sure you all remember that, but it was not the right time for me to read that. One of the stories is that a woman was in a minivan with her 2 children, and the water rose so fast that when the rescue boats came out, they didn't know the minivan was there at all. That's how fast the water rose and how completely submerged they were. This hit me hard, not just because I was about to present on that, but because had I been in Pittsburgh that day and in my backyard, I would have heard the sirens. My backyard drains to Negley Run, or it drains to Washington Boulevard, and I would have known that something was going amiss. I also think that Had we done our studies 2 years earlier, there's one site that came up in both studies. That wetland that I described, it was a bunch of industrial buildings. Had we done our studies earlier, and had we been able to rally community and resources around it, that site might have looked more like this and would have been able to sequester the amount of kind of water and change the system that might have helped prevent, lessen that disaster that day. And so I guess my story is, we need to think differently. We need to think in systems. We need to all understand that we're designers and we can take actions to change those systems. Don't wait for the professionals to come in. We need to get out there and do that, and I think eco-districts are a way to start that conversation. Thanks.